Good afternoon, Brad.
Good afternoon.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Very well. Thank you very much for being here and allowing and getting some time out of your agenda to talk about these matters. And I would like to start presenting Brad. Brad is co-founder and senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. Drawing on decades of research into fatherhood, marriage, and child well-being, Dr. Wilcox reflects on how mothers and fathers can contribute differently but equally meaningfully to a child's growth. And I was reading the article, you sent me an article that you published on The Atlantic. And so the first idea that it came to my mind is the importance of fatherhood, that maybe in our modern days, we believe that there's an well maybe there's an emphasis on the interchangeability of parenting, and and sometimes we can disregard or misregard, in this case, the complementary roles of the father and the mother. Would you like to start speaking about this and telling us why maybe that has been the case, or and yeah.
Right, yeah, and it's Felipe, right?
Yes.
Yes, Felipe. So I think that the challenge here in part is that we have a predominantly kind of egalitarian or androgynous sort of elite culture out there. And so we're often expecting, men as fathers and husbands to do more on the household front. And that's in many ways a great thing. Many of our grandfathers were not that engaged in the household. And I think that was actually a tragedy. But the newer problem, I would say, is, Felipe, is that we expect men and women to be kind of just completely the same, that interchangeable. And really the more subtle expectation on the home front, I think, is oftentimes that the husband and the father is kind of like, is sort of wife number two, mother number two, right? That he kind of just does half of whatever the mom or the wife does, kind of does it like she would want it to be done as well, basically. And I think what that misses is that, you know, men do have unique talents and gifts that they bring to the family enterprise, that we haven't, I think, appreciated as much in a more progressive era, especially among, more elite, in the circles of more elite journalists and academics and whatnot, who are kind of sort of opining on these matters. And so, yeah, so I think the challenge is how do we kind of think about, identify, articulate some of the unique gifts and talents that men bring to the parenting enterprise, to the family enterprise, and then how do we kind of equip men to be better husbands and fathers, having understood that women and men, yes, are similar in some important respects, but also quite different in other respects as well.
Yeah, and I thank you very much. And I think that this idea that you are talking about, sometimes, at the Iguales y Diferentes, that we're promoting single sex education, and we are trying to emphasize the complementarity of boys and girls, and sometimes we are thinking of how to teach a boy or how to teach a girl, that they have different development paces and different rhythms of maturation and maturity rhythms. And so, I don't know if that could be also something, to relate to this idea of fatherhood, or the idea of, for example, how a boy or how a girl are being taught.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, to be more concrete, I think one of the challenges that we face today is we're not really kind of forming our boys or forming our girls for kind of unique responsibilities in the home, in the household, in the family. And so I have a large family, a lot of kids, and with my older kids, for instance, we just sort of like, on Saturday morning is chore time.
Yeah.
And so we would just kind of divvy up the chores and kind of go from there. But as our kids have gotten older, as I've thought about these issues in more depth, I've realized that what I want to do for my younger kids is to kind of be more intentional about forming them for unique responsibilities in the household as they get older, as they become adults themselves down the road. And so with my youngest son, for instance, much more intentional about kind of having him do things outside, having him help with the lawn, having him help with the trash, having him kind of do things that would be kind of understood classically as more masculine.
Yeah,
And to kind of give him a sense of like, this is what it means to be, in the future, the man of the house. And, one also, I'm just speaking personally again, I think one way this sort of struck me was with one of my older sons. Like to be frank, he wasn't that he wasn't that helpful on Saturday mornings with chores. A lot of cleaning in the household and things like that. It was always a struggle. But one day we had a snowstorm in our neighborhood, and we live in a very hilly area with lots of windy roads. And there were a
yeah,
bunch of cars that were caught in the snow, and they were marooned in the snow, if you will. They were just stuck on the side of the road. And this son of mine took a shovel and went down the hill and shoveled like three or four cars just out of the side of the road. And this was like a major undertaking. I mean, he was down there for like 2 hours doing this. And again, he wasn't like the most, helpful kid around the home. But I think it kind of struck me as I thought about that experience. Like, I think what he was in a sense looking for was something that was a bit more, heroic, a bit more
yeah,
masculine. So I think we have to be thinking about, what is it that we can do to kind of help boys, help teenage boys, help young men, help men,
yeah.
sort of see as uniquely masculine jobs. And I think they're more likely to kind of engage, when that's sort of the task, rather than trying to kind of just divide everything up in the household and have. So I think what feminism did for us in a kind of constructive way was it basically challenged us to get men to engage more on the household front. But what it did not understand, did not appreciate is that it's helpful, I think, for all involved if you kind of give boys and men some unique, responsibilities that they can kind of own rather than kind of expecting them to do just everything on kind of the more woman's terms and kind of more her perspective about what's important on the household front.
Yeah, and also I was thinking while you were speaking of the different ways of learning that boys and girls have, and how that is reflected at the household, but also at the school, and that's why it's so
Yeah.
powerful, the idea of a girls' school or a boys' school, because it's answering to the different ways that a boy or a girl learn and interact with each other and react to different environmental, for example, circumstances. There are some studies that are really interesting because they talk about the temperature of the rooms and how that affects the behavior of boys in a way and girls in a different way. So going back to your article,
Yeah.
so one study of often cited in this discussion observed parents during children's swimming lessons, and fathers were more likely to position themselves behind the child, orienting the child toward the environment, so the father behind the child, while mothers more often position themselves face to face with the child, maintaining emotional connection and reassurance. So, what insights do you think this kind of behavior offers about maternal and paternal interaction styles with their kids?
Yeah, no, it's a great it's a great question. So yeah, again, what we have in this work that's been done sort of on the way in which dads are kind of uniquely gifted when it comes to, challenging their kids. This work done by the psychologist Daniel Paquette is that he kind of in general observes that, quote, fathers play a particularly important role in the development of children's openness to the world. They also tend to encourage children to take risks, thus permitting children to learn to be braver in unfamiliar situations, as well as to stand up for themselves. And in the context of this research, what he found, as you mentioned, is studying, toddlers being taught how to swim in France, that yeah, the moms would hold the child, eye to eye, as they were teaching the toddler how to swim, and the dads would often turn the child away and sort of like, in a sense, throw them duc and altum, out into the deep, right?
Yeah,
And this was, and I think we all make a mistake if we think that the mom's way is bad. It's important for kids to have that sense of security with
yeah,
mom, and they get it often with mom. Or if you're to make the mistake of thinking the dad's way is bad, kind of challenging the kid to kind of, figure out the water under his protection, of course, and both of these two different styles when it comes to, interacting with kids are important. But again, it underlines how fathers more than mothers are more likely to sort of encourage kids to embrace risk, to respond to difficulty with a spirit of fortitude, to do novel things, to embrace, people, places, situations that are, out of the norm. And so, dads are really important in helping kids prepare for the outside world in simple terms, to kind of like fly away from the nest, if you will. That's what dads do in part, is challenging their kids to kind of, yeah, again, get ready to leave the nest at some point.
So in that way, you cited Paquette, and Paquette in the article that you wrote also suggests that fathers frequently help children become, as you were saying, more open to the world, encouraging them to confront uncertainty while still operating within safe boundaries. So it's not
Sure, right.
to to give them the whole the whole risk. No, how do you see that dynamic influencing children's long-term development? So you were saying to some extent that that could help them in during their childhood, but what about during the teenage years and maybe as men?
Yeah, so what we do see is that kids who are being raised in an intact family with their married, mother and father are more likely to be flourishing in school. We just actually came out with a report today focusing on children in Arizona, and in this new report, we find that boys who are being raised in some kind of non-intact family are about twice as likely to be having, difficulty in school when they're being raised apart from their own married father and mother. So there's just no question that in general, kids are more likely to flourish in school and more likely to avoid difficulty with, you know, school principals, the law, et cetera. We also see, for instance, with young men in particular, that boys who have been raised apart from an intact family are more likely, and this is like in my new book, Get Married, this is my most surprising finding for kids. Boys who are raised outside of an, intact married home with their father and their mother are more likely to spend some time in prison or in jail than they are to graduate from college. And by contrast, young men who are being raised in an intact home with their mom and dad are markedly more likely to be graduating from college and spend any time in prison or jail. So and I think actually the point I'd make here is that um, work done in sort of psychology suggests that, again, when it comes to discipline, for instance, that moms actually do more discipline than dads do. They're more likely to be with their kids, kind of day in and day out. And so they have more opportunities to discipline their kids, but their discipline's more likely to be kind of tailored to the child. They're more likely to kind of adjust what they're doing because of the situation. Maybe they know that the daughter is tired, or the son is hungry, and so they're going to, whereas dad's just, it's more likely to be a standard, and when the child breaks the standard, it's going to be just a very clear consequence. But what the psychological research suggests to us is that both of those two different styles of discipline are actually helpful for kids to be exposed to, and do promote a kind of pro-social orientation on the part of kids. So I think this is in part why we do see that boys, for instance, who are raised in an intact family are much more likely to flourish in school, twice as likely to go and graduate from college, and they're about half as likely to land in prison or in jail. Girls are more likely to be avoiding depression when they have the benefit of that kind of, complementarity playing out on both when it comes to discipline and then just parenting more generally. So um, I don't have as much research that I can point to on um, the specific effects of a particular kind of paternal involvement on child outcomes. But what I do have is just plenty of research telling us is that when parents are together in a reasonably good marriage, their kids do a lot better. And but also in that Atlantic piece, that when fathers are more involved with their children, usually in an intact family, their kids are less likely to be ending up delinquent, they're less likely to be depressed, and they're also their daughters are much less likely to end up pregnant as teenagers.
So, and I was thinking when you were explaining this, so there's an interesting idea that is the complementarity between the two styles of the
Right.
mother and the father, and
Yes.
how both are different
Right.
styles, but each different style it's very important for the good and the complete development of the kid, right?
Right. No, this is exactly the point. So, we've got research by the Yale psychiatrist Kyle Pruitt, and his wife is also a psychologist, just telling us that it's the sort of the two different approaches when it comes to discipline, among other things, that is so valuable to kids to be exposed to what we might sort of classically call vive la différence, with mom and dad approaching a variety of things, including discipline in somewhat distinct ways. And it gives kids opportunities to, to navigate different ways of being, different forms of social life. I think too, like, I mean, I think if you're working on like a group project, for instance, later in life, having kind of mom's discipline is going to be helpful. It's more tailored to the particular situation. But also too, if you're, maybe heading into the military, for instance,
Hmm.
where there are going to be very clear rules and very clear sanctions if you don't follow the rules, like having dads, this one's going to be helpful to be thriving in the military. Or if you're, in some kind of, if you've been pulled over for speeding by a police officer, having had that dad experience is probably going to be helpful to you as well. So both of these different approaches are helpful in kind of creating a context where there is a sense of order, and a capacity to navigate the social world successfully for boys and girls as they grow up.
Yeah, also, I would like to ask you because some critics may worry that encouraging risk-taking could expose children to unnecessary danger or emotional stress, and that's, I think, a common critique. How would you respond to concerns like this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that actually really makes me worried today is that I see a larger minority of my students at the University of Virginia, guy students, who just seem very timid, very passive, unwilling to speak, in public. Um, and I think part of the problem is they haven't been exposed to enough risk, enough difficulty. Classically, most cultures had rites of passage, right? Where
Yeah.
it would expose teenage boys, young men to very difficult situations. It might be, hunting a lion in the bush. It might be, going on a long hike and, whatever. But in this current society, we don't tend to do that. We don't kind of expose our young men or teenage boys to really difficult, risky, physically challenging situations. And so I think it makes some of them too fragile. They need to have an experience of risk, of difficulty, of challenge, where they feel like they're being pushed to the limits and they come through that with a greater sense of fortitude and self-confidence, that will extend both to the physical world, but also to the social world and I think to the professional world as well.
At times, public discussions about parenting can unintentionally frame maternal and paternal approaches as competing models. We've been talking about this, but is the broader lesson instead that children often benefit both security and encouragement, both protection and challenge? I don't know if you've seen that in your research or in the Institute for Family Studies research with some data.
Yeah, no, there's a scholar named Rob Palkovitz who is a psychologist who studies kind of paternal and maternal forms of parenting. And he does find that kids are most likely to flourish when their fathers are engaged, affectionate, yes, but also kind of more demanding in sort of classically masculine ways. And where, yes, their moms are, maintain a certain measure of order in the home, but, are more affectionate, more nurturing in certain kind of classically feminine ways. And so, and, there's obviously a big range in terms of women and men's sort of natural inclinations and orientations. But Rob's work suggests having a, a more classically feminine mother and a more classically masculine father is associated with especially good outcomes for kids.
And then I was thinking because, for example, what we've already been noticing is that in many boys' schools, for example, there's a larger percentage of students that prefer or are also very comfortable with, for example, poetry or theater or um, the arts in general. That sometimes that is not the case in a co-ed environment, or for example, in an all-girls school, there's a larger percentage of girls devoting themselves to chemistry or more or maths or science-oriented careers. So what we see there is that in single-sex schools, they are more at ease with themselves, and to some extent, maybe this could also be applied to the idea of being oneself and the father or the mother being oneself and also helping each of their kids to develop their own character within the complementarity between boys and girls.
And that's a fascinating point, Felipe. There is this kind of notion in some parts of the social sciences of kind of male flight, that when a certain thing becomes 60% or so, give or take, female, it becomes coded. And this is none of this is conscious, right? It's sort of like an unconscious thing. It becomes coded as a female thing, and that men tend to flee from that thing. And so I think, whether it's in the church, whether it's in, uh, the arts, whether it's in music, whether it's in drama, if something becomes like coded as, well, this is something that only girls really do or girls dominate, then I think a lot of boys kind of step back, and they kind of avoid it. So one of I think the powerful draws of a single sex education is it allows boys to do things that might be coded as female or feminine in a co-ed school. So it's easier to be a poet, to be a painter, to be an actor in an all boys school than it might be in a co-ed school. And obviously the sort of same idea would be true for perhaps for girls as well, in the sense that like it's easier maybe to be, a chemist or a computer science um, you know, uh, person, in an all girls high school perhaps than it would be in a co-ed context. So that certainly seems like a plausible hypothesis that has some kind of merit in the research.
And I would like to go a little bit more practical in these last minutes that we have. So how can modern families cultivate this complementary dynamic in everyday life, and especially in cultural contexts where fathers are sometimes expected to play a more limited role in caregiving and emotional development? And would how would a family could cultivate this dynamic?
There's a new book that just came out this spring called The Intentional Household by the philosopher John Kutabak, who is a professor of philosophy at Christendom College. And he's thinking about this in a more, he's a philosopher in a more sort of meditative way, but he does have some practical points. And he's really trying to get us to think about the ways in which, men as husbands are called to kind of husband the home. And his home is on a farm. So there's a lot of like practical things. And my wife would just sort of like laugh with the notion of me like talking about, men farming or whatever, But his point is that as men, we have to think about ways that we can be much more practically engaged in the home. We making things, fixing things, like being practical, and this is an important thing for the men to kind of figure out, in this new moment we're living in, but to sort of really kind of cultivate for themselves a more practical role in the household that's distinctive from Cuddeback's perspective. And likewise, women would have certain kind of, domestic arts that they're cultivating. And the idea is to sort of you're creating a context in the home where food is being produced in the home, where entertainment is being produced in the home, not watched on a screen. You're playing music, you're having guests over, you're having little mini concerts, you're, having uh, feast days celebrated in the home. But his whole idea is that we need to reinscribe the home with meaning and purpose and functions. But that's not, and this is a very important point to make here, it's not the job of the wife, the mother. It's the job of both the husband and the wife to work together to create a context where they're bringing different talents and gifts into this work of, making our homes refunctionalized, and to stop kind of going out to eat all the time and relying on screens all the time to feed us both, practically, intellectually, spiritually, and aesthetically.
Wow, that's a whole topic and really interesting. I'm taking some notes also of this book. I think it's also that would be for another session, but the idea of this the screens and how they affect mainly the child's education and boys more specifically, but also and the final question I would like to ask you. So what would you say to young parents who may feel uncertain about the unique contribution they can make to their children's emotional and personal growth? They are starting, right, the family life, and maybe they are not so sure of what they can do and how specific ways to. We were talking about this to some extent, but
Yeah, so I think, as I've been writing about this, I kind of talk about it for men in terms of just providing, playing, challenging, and disciplining your kids, recognizing that you often have somewhat different gifts to bring. And so we still see in America today about 66% of family income for married families comes from the father. So just, understanding, appreciating that, providership matters and trying to do what you can to be a good provider financially is, I think, an important thing to focus on. There are often a lot of side gigs that people have nowadays. I mean, maybe AI can help you with a side gig that can kind of bring in more income to help, pay for the costs of raising your kids. That's always one thing to keep in mind. The second thing when it comes to playing with your kids, just to be aware of all this research telling us that dads who play with their kids physically, who like wrestle with their kids on like a Saturday morning, their little kids, roughhousing on the family room floor, seems to be really great for kids. Then as they get older, throwing a basketball, football, baseball, doing other kinds of active, things with your kids is super important for dads. Um, and there are those of us like myself who are not that athletic, but you just have to, make the effort to get out there and do those things with your kids. Even if it's a cause, as it is for me, of being humbled by my children, athletically. Um, Third thing is just, as I said before, challenging your kids, recognize you've got a unique role as the father to kind of really push your kids to level up and to do difficult things, whether it's camping, sports, standing up for a kid at school is being bullied, disagreeing with a teacher or professor, just helping your kids, just as I said, kind of level up and develop a sense of fortitude. And then discipline too, that recognizing at a certain level that the buck stops with you and that you have to kind of, guarantee a certain measure of order in the home and respect for yourself and for your wife from the kids as well. So I think these are four things that are particularly important for dads to focus on when it comes to raising the next generation.
thank you very much, Brad. It has been a pleasure to talk with you. Yeah, and I think this is an ongoing conversation, and I think it will be really helpful because we don't have the data, we don't have the well, all the psychological also and sociological research that the Institute for Family Studies and yourself you've done, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Felipe, for having me on today, and I'm delighted to hear you guys are working on this effort of trying to expand the presence and the influence of single-sex schools.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Okay, thank you, Felipe.